Vito basically talked a lot about the dangers for UBI to buy into the system, if you like. To put it quite very, there was obviously a lot more going on. That's exactly what I'm going to do now. I'm going to adopt the perspective of what is it that we do when we think about basic income as a policy that we want to implement right now, which unfortunately means partly buying into the system. Okay? Now, none of what I'm going to say, actually, I have a lot of sympathy for the criticisms that Vito and many others have put forward. But we're constantly facing this challenge between, on the one hand, thinking about the ideas, and on the other hand, confronting the realities. And Olli was talking about this as well in terms of the experiment, right, in Finland. You can come up with all sorts of great ideas, and then you have to talk to the politicians and to the decision makers, and all sorts of constraints come in. So the project that I'm involved in at the moment is about thinking about basic income very specifically within the context of welfare reform today. And when I was invited originally, I think the title of the program changed slightly, because if I remember correctly, the original title was Basic Income and the Welfare State. And I was so excited about that, because I think in many ways, well, first I thought you were doing a Congress especially for me, because that is what I'm working on. But I realized maybe that wasn't exactly what was going on. But nevertheless, one of the things that I find and found a bit troubling for a while in the basic income discussion is that we're often having that discussion on the side of the welfare state literature. There's a huge amount of research about the pressures that welfare states are facing, how they deal with them, how you find a lot of different ways that different welfare states are trying to move ahead. And that is the reality that we have to deal with. And to the extent that basic income is a policy that we seriously want to think about as a policy, that is the reality that we need to re-engage with, right? So that is partly the background to thinking about, in a sense, the political economy of unconditional basic income in the context of, let's call them mature, advanced welfare, Western welfare states, right? So I'm deliberately not saying anything about the global south here. That is, in many ways, a different world and faces a lot of challenges, the whole sort of post-colonial colonization aspect that Vito was talking about. So why do I think the welfare state stuff is important? Because welfare states are not going to disappear. They're going to be here, they're going to be they're going to stay here, they're not going to go away. Thinking of basic income as somehow something that is either parallel to welfare states or will fundamentally transform them, in the short or medium run, it doesn't seem very plausible to me. So, so let's kind of keep that reality in place. There's two other very important reasons. When we think about basic income, we often like to say a basic income will do this, will do that. Actually, it doesn't. A basic income will have effects depending on how it interacts with a variety of other policies, whether these are income maintenance policies, labor market policies, family policies, education policy, housing policy, you name it. Okay? Basic income will interact with each of these, and depending on what sort of policies are in place, your specific basic income model will have different effects on poverty, on inequality, on opportunities, and so on and so forth. So we need to think about that. Basic income is an integrated model in a welfare state. We need to think about the whole package. And that means engaging with the whole package, clearly. And also, and this is the third point here, we need to think about the politics of basic income very much in the context of welfare states. There's a huge literature of how social policy programs are, made politically possible or hindered, depending on a lot of programs already being in place. Policy itself creates political opportunities to put another policy in place or not, to keep a policy in place or not. So we're talking about inserting policies, we're talking about stability of policies over time, and so on and so forth. So basic income, the political feasibility and stability of basic income, we need to start understanding in the context of what I like to call the dynamic politics of welfare state developments. As part of a team, so the University of Bath has the Institute of Policy Research. There's several people working on this particular topic. This is a project that we've just kind of started up, so this is very, very much early days of thinking that I'm presenting here. But one feature that we like to emphasize and we want to research going forward is the idea that basic income is not just a single idea. We are actually talking about something that we might call varieties of basic income, different models that are integrated in very different types of welfare states, right? So one of the things that we definitely want to look at is to what extent something that looks like a single idea becomes something very, very different depending on whether this is being discussed in the UK or in Portugal or in Finland or in Belgium, you name it, okay? And several of the speakers here, and Vito in particular, for example, has mentioned this already as well. So I definitely support this idea that basic income as such can have quite a lot of variety, right? So that as background. What I want to do is something a bit radical, a bit controversial. I want to bring two types of debates together that really don't like each other. So I want to talk about the social investment welfare state. Social investment people tend not to like basic income very much. They think basic income is a passive policy and they like active policies. Basic income people don't tend to like social investment very much because it's always talking about activation and labor markets, and in basic income we like to talk about other things, okay? It's a bit like putting the Finns and the Swedes in a room and see what happens. So, right? So that's what, or the Belgians, you know, the Flemish and the Walloons, you know, we put them in a room and we see what happens. My starting point, or what I kind of want to put forward, is that there may be a lot more synergies between these two types of developments. So in some way, you know, one argument is to say, perhaps there is more room for basic income to appreciate the social investment perspective, and perhaps there's more room for the social investment perspective to appreciate basic income. And that actually has a very, very important result, because if that is true, it just happens to be the case that social investment is one of the important paradigms that is currently operating at the level of policy and at the level of policy research. So if we can make basic income fit in that, to some extent, you know, purely for political feasibility reasons, that seems worthwhile exploring, okay? What do I mean by that? So I'm going to very, very briefly introduce you to social investment. I'm sure plenty of people here know this literature well, so just going to be very, very quick. As a matter of policy, social investment has been a big deal in Europe. I mean, actually, the Lisbon strategy, you know, 2000, was one of the highlight points. That strategy itself was kind of deemed unsuccessful. I mean, the final evaluation wasn't all that glowing, but social investment hasn't disappeared. So in 2013, the EC actually, you know, reinstituted a social investment package, you know, for growth and social inclusion. So social investment is part of the ongoing debate within Europe, at the European level and at the national welfare states, about welfare reform, all tied in with, you know, the knowledge-based economy, making sure that knowledge-based economy gets us to economic growth, social inclusion, social cohesion, through the productive function of social policy. All very fancy words to say we want to bring economy and society somehow together. It's all about raising human capital, skill-based productivity, and so on and so forth. So all that's fine. So very important at the level of policy. At the level of research, it's become a big deal as well. So we now have an emergent paradigm, if you like. So people like Anton Heemrijk, Frank van den Broeke, a whole bunch of other people, Bonoli to some extent, are trying to figure out whether this social investment paradigm is something that can capture a number of things that are going on in terms of labor market development, in terms of human capital, in terms of minimum income policies, in terms of family policy, and so on. And they want to differentiate this, on the one hand, from the sort of the passive policies of the Keynesian welfare state, if you like, but on the other hand, very strictly from the neoliberal policies of the retrenchment state, right? So the idea of social investment is not, or allegedly, you know, there's some debate about whether this is really possible and whether they've managed to do this. But as a concept, the idea of social investment actually does require proper investment. This is about investing in people, right, in order to create what they think is positive returns in terms of economic variables, in terms of social variables. And what do I do with this?
The cross.
Sure. And you know, as you can imagine, since this is an ongoing paradigm, there's still a lot of debate of trying to make all the different bits work. There's a lot of debate to what extent this has been properly implemented. There's a lot of worry that there's negative effects and so on and so forth. And you know, I definitely don't want to put this forward as social investment is the great paradigm. I don't personally necessarily believe that. What I want to say is it's an important paradigm. It's one of the leading ones. So let's just see what we can do with that in terms of basic income. I'm going to go through this quite a bit fast. I just want to quickly mention the bottom part of this slide. When we think about social investment, what do we actually mean? Anton Heemrijk has actually given us sort of a nice little scheme. He talks about social investment as a stock, in the first place. This is about improving individuals' human capital and capabilities, making sure that people themselves are as well as possible prepared for entering, if you like, you know, the labor market or the market in general or society in general. Like this is about things like education, lifelong education, and so on and so forth. Secondly, social investment as a flow. This is the idea that, you know, for various sort of reasons, this is all tied in with important changes in labor markets, demographics, sociology. For various reasons, we now have to adopt a life course approach. It's no longer necessarily true that we have clear stages in our life where we face particular risks. The idea is that things have become more fluid. People have to respond more fluidly. So that means being able to, for example, you know, reorientate yourself in different parts of your life if it happens to be the case that that is what is necessary. So investing in people's ability to flow in various ways in and out of labor markets as they are needed is part of this argument. And to put a positive spin on this, this is not just being ejected from a labor market. This may be, for example, you know, moving out of the labor market precisely because you want to engage in different education later on in life, or because you've decided to make some changes in the work-life balance, or you've decided to take on parenting or care obligations, right? So there's a lot of positive things here. Thirdly, social investment as a buffer. Very important. From the social investment perspective, and quite different from the neoliberals, it is important that we have robust universal social protection and safety nets, right? It is a clear angle of the social investment approach that minimum income schemes, for example, are present, right? This is not just about cutting and cutting and cutting and letting people sit there, at least in the paradigm, again, leaving aside for the moment whether that has been properly implemented, right? So 3 functions: stock, flow, buffer. So now let's get to basic income. Offhand, you might think basic income is the antithesis of social investment. Why? Because social investment is about activating people and basic income seems to be passive. Now, I personally don't like the active and passive distinction. I think it's pretty much untenable for all sorts of reasons. So we can look at it slightly different. I mean, using Esping-Anderson's view, you know, in some sense, basic income is about decommodification. It's about, you know, being protected from the risks of the market by, you know, somehow being outside of the market, if you like. Social investment is about recommodification. It's about preparing people, enabling people to better negotiate the risks associated with the market, if you like, right? So it's a slightly different perspective here. But on that slightly different perspective, UBI, you know, basic income, nevertheless is regarded as, you know, not quite fitting. Why? Because we have an entitlement by virtue of being a citizen. There's no conditionality, right? There's no work conditionality, no willingness to work, no sense of, you know, having to engage with education in any strict sense. And therefore, the social investment people would say, clearly, this is a retreat to passive decommodification. Social investment and basic income seems to be totally antagonistic, okay? I want to say that that's not the case. So let's take a closer look. Can we discover synergies, if you like, between basic income debate and the social investment debate? You know, if we take the previous slide as the starting point, is there a way in which we can dig deeper and we can nevertheless find some ideas of overlap? Can we find common ideas? Can we find common interest, common goals, you know? Can we find sort of mutually reinforcing policy mechanisms? Is there a way in which, you know, basic income as a mechanism might actually assist social investment, or the other way around? And what about the politics? Are there interesting dynamics that may be similar between, trying to implement social investment policies and trying to implement something like a basic income as part of that? So let's quickly go over a few points here. Let's start with buffers. This goes back to the Anton Heemberg point. As I've already said, minimum income protection, a key condition, critical precondition, as Heemberg himself says, for social investment, right? Partly to mitigate economic transitions, economic stability, security, and so on and so forth. I mean, in a nutshell, it's impossible to ask people that they, that they easily transition from one stage in life to another, or they build up their human capital if they're basically, starving and living on the street and so on and so forth. So the intuition behind this is not that far to figure out, right? It's fairly, fairly straightforward. The biggest problem that we've had at the level of implementation, say for example in the UK, they've implemented activation measures, but only the negative incentive ones. Basically people were pushed into poverty, if you like, by insisting more and more on active preconditions, active conditions in response to receiving minimum income protection, if you like. So that is a problem. So where does basic income come in? Well, very obviously, the very straightforward answer is basic income, of course, does offer income security at a modest level. And of course, we can have debates about how high that level has to be. But whatever level it's at, it's there and it's secure by virtue of being unconditional, right? And we do anticipate that this has important effects on poverty, on the vulnerable groups. And when I say anticipate is that we need to be very careful because microsimulations, for example, have shown that in various sort of ways, basic income sometimes can have perverse effects. So we need to be careful how it's designed, how it's implemented. And of course, the experiments will give us, hopefully, important information on this as well. But the really interesting bit is that basic income can combine income security with activation. Why? Because it reduces poverty, unemployment, and bureaucratic traps. These are the traps that Oli Kangas was mentioning, right? Again, whether or not it actually achieves to do this, that is something that partly the experiments are going to give us evidence about. But the idea, the mechanism underlying this is that where conditional income support often includes all these traps, for the reasons that Oli explained, basic income is trying to get rid of that. That is a very important enabling feature from an activation perspective. So the interesting thing for UBI is that it actually supports at-risk poverty, both in and out of work, which seems to be a very interesting feature, really, if you adopt the social investment perspective. So that's buffers. Buffers is the easy one. What about stocks? So stocks is about human capital, knowledge-based economy, skill-based inequalities, and so on and so forth. So one of the key features of the social investment approach is a strong, strong focus on two things. First of all, early years development. We want to actually promote as much as possible people's human capital development in the early years. Why? Because, investing in early years basically gives you the best returns throughout the life, if you like, right? I mean, there's no point in making sure that every 50-year-old person is properly educated. You want to make sure that people are educated earlier on in life for very obvious reasons. A second point as well, though, is the focus on the life course. Being able to adapt to changing circumstances. And we've heard this before today. There is the expectation that there's going to be a lot of changes coming. We're not entirely sure, but we're feeling already a variety of pressures. So one of the answers from the social investment perspective is allowing people to adapt as much as possible, giving people the enabling features, the opportunity to adapt to different changes in circumstances and risks associated with that. Interestingly enough, we see the same agenda in basic income. There's a lot of people talking in basic income about supporting the young, whether this is for intergenerational justice or whether this is from a life course kind of perspective, right? So, for example, practically, we often think about basic income being an important feature of supporting early labor market entrants, right? Which these are the people who are often now excluded in a lot of programs. UK, again, great example. In terms of lifelong learning, for example, basic income is sometimes talked about as sabbatical grants. This allows you to just take the time out and say that, look, I'm sort of done with what I've been doing in the past 10 years. My basic income allows me to take the time out, do something else, whether this is starting an enterprise, whether this is re-educating myself, whether this is, taking on a different sort of job just to try out and see whether it happens. These are features that are critical in the basic income debate, but they map on fairly straightforwardly, so to speak, if you like, on the social investment paradigm. I want to say something about quality of jobs as well. One of the key features of the social investment approach is that this is not just about getting people in employment. The argument is that actually this is about quality jobs. This is about people getting into the sort of jobs that definitely incur, important security, important sort of self-fulfillment, and so on and so forth. Those are the sort of jobs that will deliver economic growth and social inclusion and social cohesion. Dumping people into crappy jobs is not the sort of thing that they want, right? Again, the implementation in reality might be a different story, but that is what the approach is about. Again, basic income, very much the same idea. The idea of a basic income is partly, at least, to empower people to move along from a crappy job into something better, including perhaps, taking on a part-time job or a lower paid job initially, right, if that is what you like. People often, people like Karl Weiderquist and several others, actually Philippe van Parijs started using this language, often talk about this as the freedom and the power to say no. I actually don't think that quite works. I think saying no is a bit overstating things, but nevertheless, I think a basic income can have some positive effects on people's ability to move along. All of that is totally compatible with the social investment approach. So what about flows? So as I mentioned already, social investment talks about life course insurance approach, working-life balance, taking time out for parenting, care, education, and allowing labor market insertion after. So one of the risks is that people may be opting out of something, for family reasons, say, well, I'm going to have to reduce my hours, I'm going to have to perhaps move job or take out a job, and not being able to get back in again. So the sort of support that we need for that is very important. It's actually very important for gender inequality and gender justice. There's a very strong agenda that, in fact, that in one of my worries with, for example, the automation debate and the robot debate about basic income is that we've lost track about gender equality and about the care agenda, right? Which I think is at least equally important, if not more. So for me, basic income supports such an agenda by allowing income security to be uninterrupted throughout the life course, right? This is the key feature. You have your basic income for the rest of your life, right? Independent of what you do. This allows you to adapt over the life course, right? A strong focus on issues around care and education is also part of the debate. If you look at the basic income debate, this is a big feature of that sort of debate. And the link with gender equality agenda, as I said, until very recently, it seems to have disappeared for some reason. But the gender equality agenda was there and should still be there and probably is still there, sort of floating slightly underneath the big robots agenda at the moment. So many people regard basic income even as a sort of a universal type of care allowance, right? And again, we can debate whether that's the right sort of language. But my key argument here is on the buffers, on the stock, and on the flow. We seem to find at least some synergies in terms of similar ideas that are actually not that antagonistic as you might think. And we seem to have a mechanism, basic income, the very feature of a basic income, being able to support people in work and out of work, allowing for flexibility and allowing for security. These features, lifelong, right, throughout the life course, seem to be the sort of things actually that social investment people should be interested in. So I want to give you a quick quote. This is from a paper that is, just 1 minute and then I'll finish. This is from a paper that is actually very supportive of social investment, but nevertheless recognizes that in practice, finding the policies, right, finding a combination of policies that really works is very problematic. And they identify the following trilemma. They basically say, if you're an egalitarian social investment person, then you want to make sure that the unemployed are not poor. You want to make sure that administrative monitoring systems are not excessively intrusive and cumbersome. And you want to ensure economic growth and employment growth, right, to reduce benefit dependency. And the main reason for that, of course, is that, you know, it creates the very basis upon which we can then build our programs. Van den Broek and Vlemings, they basically argue that this is really, really very problematic. Well, try and map basic income on this. Basic income is supposed to be an answer to these three at the same time, okay? Now, I'm not going to say it's, you know, this is necessarily going to work. We're going to have to be very careful in terms of designing this, in terms of implementing and seeing how it works. But if this is a problem, if this is the trilemma that social investment faces, it seems that basic income at least can have an answer. I'm just going to take 30 seconds. I had more to say about politics, but I want to say one very quick thing, and I'll stop with that. In the social investment literature, there has been acceptance that we have different social investment welfare states. There is what they refer to as the liberal social investment welfare state, which has focused on negative incentives, activation through negative incentives, and, you know, in some sense, pushing everything toward the bottom, if you like. Classic example, UK. Very different from what's referred to as the universal social investment state, which in some sense managed to lift people up by partly enabling things. And the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, are part of that story, right? So we need to think about the implications for the politics of basic income. So we need to think, you know, it's one thing to talk about social investment in general, but we need to accept the variety and the complications when we think about how these are actually implemented. So one question is whether a basic income would be more politically feasible in something like a universal social investment welfare state versus a liberal one. In a nutshell, you know, is basic income going to be more likely to happen in Scandinavia, Nordic welfare states, or in Britain, or elsewhere? And then the second question is, does that mean that we have a strong differentiation between liberal and universal basic income models? Regressive models, progressive models, you know? It may be one thing to say that we can adopt basic income to fit into the UK, but that type of basic income may simply not be the sort of basic income that generates the sort of things that we would be interested in, that even the social investment paradigm is interested in. So we need to be, so this is kind of a note of caution. When it comes to the politics, we need to be very careful. I had a bit more on that, but that I'm going to leave for another time.